Japan, the land of the rising sun. A nation renowned for its technologically advanced cities, traditional cultural offerings, and immense natural wonders, which together make for one of the most sought-after tourist destinations in the world, attracting millions of visitors each year. Surprisingly, however, this level of openness to outsiders is a relatively recent phenomenon in the nation's history. In fact, for well over 200 years from the 17th to 19th centuries, Japan's borders were firmly closed to any outside visitors whatsoever. This time period, known as sakoku, bore witness to a flourishing of Japanese culture, rapid economic growth, and dynamic societal developments, which up until that point had never been seen before. As a result, this gifted the nation with many of the iconic cultural treasures whose legacies have survived to this day. But how did this island nation undergo such a dramatic transition from a period of relative isolation into becoming one of the most developed and open countries in the world? Today, this is the history of Japan. All of our videos enter up the modern nation of Japan, part of 40,000 years, with the first human settlers migrating there from mainland Asia. These early inhabitants brought skills such as agriculture and metalworking with them, which laid the groundwork for the establishment of permanent settlements and eventually king. By the 3rd century AD, a significant portion of southern Japan had coalesced into a centralized power structure based around the Yamato region, which was ruled under a system headed by a monarch known as the Emperor. Much of Japan's early history would be shaped and influenced by cultures from the Asian mainland, with Buddhism being introduced to the region in the year 552 from Korea, and later in 645, a series of reforms, known as the Taika reforms, being implemented to remodel the political landscape of the country and mirror the Chinese system based around an imperial court. This court initially did not have a permanent home, and was moved to a different location with each passing emperor. 794, when Emperor Kamu decided to fix the capital in one place, modern-day Kyoto, thereby initiating the beginning of the Heian period, which was to last for almost 400 years. Over time, however, the imperial court became grandiose and too focused on internal politics, neglecting proper governance of the country outside of the capital and greatly weakening its own authority as a consequence. The land that was formerly under the control of the emperor began to gradually slip into the hands of local noble elites, which led to the emergence of a feudal system where power was decentralized and not centered on the imperial court in Kyoto. This decline in the central authority of the state led to powerful regional warrior clans, like the Taira and Minamoto, grow in strength, backed by the military might of their samurai warriors. They were ultimately able to challenge the dominance of the emperor during the Heian Rebellion of 1160, which was sparked by disagreement over who should inherit the imperial throne. This in turn escalated into the Jin War of 1182-1185, with the Minamoto clan, headed by its faction leader Yomo, eventually winning out over their rivals and subsequently establishing a new and separate military government based in the city of Kamakura, far away from the imperial court of the emperor in Kyoto. Yoma was able to go further and convince the Emperor Guba grant him the title of shogun, or great general, in 1192, effectively making him the de facto ruler of all Japan, and initiating a period of military rule called the shogunate that was to last for the next 700 years. The fighting abilities of the samurai would soon be put to the test once again at the beginning of the 13th century, when one of the largest empires in history turned its attention towards conquering Japan. In 1265, the Mongol Empire headed by Bai Kublai demanded that Japan submit to him as a vassal state. But after receiving no response, the Mongol leader began to plan a full-scale invasion of the country. The Mongol forces landed on the island of Kyushu in 1274 and met a determined, although significantly smaller force of samurai in battle. Despite being severely outnumbered, the tide turned in favor of the Japanese defenders. Or divine winds suddenly swept through the region and destroyed practically, but remarkably faced the exact same outcome as what had befallen earlier, with their forces being wiped out by yet another typhoon. Although they had successfully seen off the threat of invasion, Japan's defensive efforts had nevertheless almost bankrupted the treasury of the shogunate, and consequently, many of the samurai were not paid for their services. This greatly soured relations between the military government and the samurai clans. And so, in 1333, Emperor Gotao launched a coup with the aim of restoring power to reside with him as emperor in the imperial court in Kyoto. Despite being successful in this endeavor, this state of affairs did not last long, for just 5 years later. In 1338, Gotao himself was overthrown in another coup which restored the power of the shogun under the new leadership of Ashikaga Taki. Even though the shogun's authority had been restored, actual power within Japan was retained amongst the regional samurai clans whose feudal lords, called daimyo, directly controlled the land for themselves. These clans would often forge alliances and plot against one another to alter the balance of power within the country as they saw fit, which more often than not resulted in open civil war. The most violent of these conflicts broke out in 1467, with the war being fought to decide who would succeed the ruling shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa. The daimyos took sides in the conflict and effectively caused the feudal system to collapse, carving up the country for themselves into a patchwork of smaller independent states. This chaotic time, known to history as the Warring States or sakoku period, continued well into the 16th century. Significant military developments such as the emergence of ninjas who carried out covert assassinations and espionage missions, as well as the deployment of Buddhist warrior monks called so on the battlefields, although a paradigm shift in the fighting occurred in 1543. Portuguese trading ship was blown off course onto the island of Tanai, just south of Kyushu. The 3 Portuguese traders on board were the first Europeans to set foot in Japan, and they quickly established merchant relations network which covered much of the Indo-Pacific region. Once a year, the Black Ship, as the Japanese refer to Portuguese vessel, arrived off the coast to buy and sell merchandise, chief amongst which were European muskets. These weapons were completely unknown to the Japanese before this time, and as a result, they quickly proved popular among the feuding daimyos, who were looking to gain a tactical advantage, so much so that by 1556, over 300 firearms were being used in the ongoing civil war. Similarly, the Portuguese also introduced Christianity to Japan, which greatly benefited their trading operations, with new converts being given preferential treatment in their ability to purchase guns, as well as in some cases receiving direct military support from the Portuguese themselves. One of the most prominent stows to cooperate with the Portuguese was Oda Nogue, who, although did not convert to Christianity, harnessed the technological superiority of European gunpowder weapons to great effect, and began to unite Japan under his rule during the final stages of his grab for power. In 1582, however, Noga was ambushed and killed. He was quickly succeeded by one of his followers, Toyoto Miyoshi, a man of humble peasant origins, who had risen through the ranks of the army to become a samurai daimyo, and who went on to complete ambitions of his former master and unify the country despite being the de facto ruler of a now unified Japan. Hiyoshi did not assume the rank of shogun, perhaps owing to his peasant background, and instead ruled as kaku, imperial regent, as well as Taudian chancellor of the realm. He intended to bestow these titles. Mihiori, however, being still only a child at the time, Hiyoshi asked his 5 most trusted subordinates. Tokugawa shogunate introduced a series of harsh punitive measures to quell any potential form of social unrest, and severely clamped down on Christianity, spreading further within the country before eventually outlawing it entirely in 1638 in order to prevent any further foreign influences from taking hold in the country. The third Tokugawa Ichu introduced a policy known as sakoku in 1639, which effectively closed the country to outsiders and prevented any Japanese people from traveling abroad, returning from overseas, or building ocean-going vessels. Limited trade was only permitted with neighboring China and Korea, and the only Europeans granted a trading license were the Dutch, who were confined to the small island of Dima of music, Nagasaki. The remainder of the 17th century saw Japan continue to prosper and flourish under the successive Tokugawa shogunates, with the population doubling to 30 million and the government constructing roads and schools to greatly improve the socio-economic output of the country. However, by the late 1700s and early 1800s, cracks had begun to show in the strength. The rapid growth in agriculture that had defined the early years of the Edo period had come to a halt, and the government's response to devastating famines during the 1830s was severely inadequate. While all this was going on, some Western ideas had gradually begun to take hold in the country. Owing to the introduction of Dutch books, European scientific discoveries, which were translated into Japanese and distributed from their trading base at Daima, Japan. Period of isolation would come to an abrupt end. In 1853, when a fleet of American warships, led by Commodore Matthew Perry, arrived in Edo Bay, the U.S. government wished to open Japan's ports to international trade and was prepared to use military force to secure this goal, if necessary, being unable to match the superior firepower of the U.S. forces. The shogunate reluctantly agreed to Perry's demands and opened up the country to American commercial interests, later extending this policy to other Western powers such as Britain and Russia. This seeming capitulation to the Western powers angered many within Japan, particularly those from the southern provinces of Choshu and Satsuma. They quickly formed alliance, and in 1868 convinced the young Emperor Magi to issue a decree calling for an end to the Tokugawa shogunate. The armies of Choshu and Satsuma then marched on Edo, leading to the Ban War, and ultimately the downfall of the shogunate. Subsequently regained supreme power over the country, marking a significant shift in Japan's governance. In 1869, the imperial court relocated to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, and formally signaled the start of the Mai Restoration. This would witness Japan embark on a new journey towards modernization, aiming to become a fully fledged nation state on par with the Western powers under the MAG government. Priority was given to modernizing infrastructure with introduction of railways, telegraph lines, as well as a universal education system. Christianity. The government also enlisted the expertise of hundreds of advisors from Western nations, who shared their knowledge in various fields, such as mining, banking, law, and transportation, to help further Japan's modernization efforts. One particular area of focus was on the military, which underwent a significant adoption of the latest Western tactics and technologies. In 1877, this updated army was deployed to quell the Satsuma rebellion, which had broken out due to the grievances of local samurai, who had seen their roles as the nation's traditional fighting force become obsolete in the face of a modern standing army. Japan's new military might was also put to use in expanding the nation's territory overseas in an attempt to replicate the colonial possessions of many of the Western powers of the time. Hokkaido and annexing the Ryukyu Islands, Japan turned its attention towards China and Korea in the First Sino-Japanese War of 189. For 1895, Japan's highly motivated and well-led forces achieved a stunning victory over the larger military of Qing China. Taiwan. As a result, in 1902, Japan signed a significant military alliance. Britain, in order to counter the rising threat posed by Russian expansion in the region. The inevitable clash with Russia ultimately came at the Battle of the Yo River, which marked the first time in decades that an Asian power had defeated a Western one. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 culminated in the dramatic Battle of Sima, in which Japan's newly built navy virtually annihilated their Russian opponents, these military successes allowed Japan to assert its dominance further across the region by annexing Korea in 1910. Not just as a regional power, but now as a predominant Asian power on the world stage, motivated by these recent military triumphs and further aspirations to expand across the Asia-Pacific region. Japan joined the Allies in the First World War, with the aim of acquiring new colonies in the South Pacific that were nominally under German control following the conclusion of the war. Japan participated in the Treaty of Versailles and enjoyed favorable international relations, which were bolstered by its membership to the League of Nations. However, like many other countries during the post-war period, nationalist and fascist-inspired sentiment began to take hold within Japanese society, particularly within the military, whose expansionist ambitions were becoming increasingly bolder. These aspirations triggered the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, which saw further territorial acquisitions on the Chinese mainland and a growing distrust of Japan's intentions in the region by the international community. Alarmed by this aggression and increasing levels of expanse, United States imposed harsh economic sanctions on Japan to hinder any further war effort. With the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, Japan realized that it needed to realign itself geopolitically with other nations who shared similar expansionist views, and consequently forged an alliance with Germany and Italy. In 1940, worsened its relations with the US. Japan also alienated other Western powers such as Britain, the Netherlands, and France by occupying further territory, Asia, and encroaching upon the colonial possessions of the European powers. Ultimately, however, Japan's government, under the leadership of Prime Minister and General Tojo, decided that it would need to preemptively strike against the United States if it was to lift the economic sanctions imposed upon it and secure the recent territorial acquisitions it had made in the Pacific. On the 7th of December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the American fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This assault prompted the United States to enter World War II on the side of the Allies and begin military operations against the Empire of Japan, which had by now conquered other territories in Asia, including the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. The Allies, spearheaded by the United States, in a fierce and prolonged fight across the Pacific against Japanese forces. One of the key objectives was to secure small islands with strategically placed airfields that could be used for launching bombing raids on the Japanese mainland. However, the increasingly costly and slow progress of the fighting led the United States to realize that a ground invasion of Japan itself would result in incalculable losses for their troops. As a result, they decided to utilize a newly developed secret weapon, Japan to surrender on the 6th and the 9th of August 1945. The U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing the deaths of well over 100,000 people. The surrender of Japan was conveyed to the Allies on the 14th of August and was publicly announced by Emperor Hirohito on national radio The following day, with the war over, Japan came under the occupation of Allied forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, who initiated the reconstruction process. The Japanese military was disarmed and the government underwent a process of democratization, although Emperor Hirohito was allowed to remain in his position. He was required to publicly disavow his divine status, which had become a central tenet of the state. Shinto, religious system under the guidance of Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida. Japan shifted its focus towards economic development rather than pursuing an assertive foreign policy by 1955. The Japanese economy had surpassed its pre-war levels, and by 1968, it had emerged as the world's second-largest capitalist economy. The following decades would see Japan established itself as a global leader in automobile manufacturing and as a major player in the electronics industry, resulting in an economic boom that was backed by Japanese-made consumer goods. All of this post-war economic activity helped to shake Aesop and mold Japan into the successful nation that it is today, one that ranks high in almost every measure of global output and development, from economics to technology and even life expectancy. All of this is owed to the arduous work ethic and tenacity of the Japanese people who, after having suffering hardship during the final stages of the world's most destructive conflict, decided to embark on a different path altogether towards rebuilding a modern nation-state that was free from the hostilities, divisiveness, and inequalities of the past.